Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Automated Testing for SAP Fiori Applications. I'm Mark Beebe, Marketing Campaign Manager for Worksoft, and your host for today's session. First, a couple of logistical points. We do have a large number of people on the call today, so the lines will be muted, but we will take your questions toward the end of this 60-minute broadcast. Please use the question feature to submit questions at any time during the webinar. For questions that we can't get to during the Q&A session, we will be sure to get back to you with an email reply. We will also make a link to the recording of this webinar available for registrants who were unable to make it, or perhaps for colleagues you think might benefit from the material. Let me now introduce our speakers. We are privileged to have Mike Veach and Aaron Kriegshauser with us today. Mike is a solution architect and has been with Worksoft for 2 years. Over the course of his career, Mike has served in a variety of roles, including application development, methodology development, training and education, and account planning and startup. For the past 15 years, Mike has been focused on SAP implementations, leading both strategy and implementation projects. Aaron is a professional problem solver and a software programmer in that order. Aaron has over 20 years of experience building software to solve problems that make people's lives easier. He has been working on Worksaw Certified since 2014 and is currently the software development manager responsible for the product and its various automation interfaces. In his spare time, he teaches software programming at Collin County Community College, dabbles in acrylic painting, and rides dirt bikes. So with those introductions, and without further ado, let me turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. As Mark said, I'm Mike Veach, and my colleague Aaron and I are going to talk today about automated testing for SAP Fiori applications. So a couple of points that we want to talk about. First, we're going to talk about some of the key considerations, points about SAP Fiori and the testing considerations that come along with that. We're also going to talk about best practices. What have we learned about automating testing Fiori? We're also going to look at traditional script-based testing approach, and then we're going to look at how we would do that same type of testing using Worksoft automation. So what is Fiori, right? If you're on this call, you probably have a pretty good idea of what Fiori is, but just want to take a minute to level set on this. When you talk about Fiori, there's really multiple answers. You'll hear that it's the successor to the traditional SAP GUI, right, that we all know and love. It's the interface for S/4HANA. You'll hear that it's a consistent user experience. And really, it's all of those things. Typically, what you hear is that people use it as a shorthand to refer to the web-based interface. And what I wanted to put up here is just the quote from SAP, right? That it's the design language for all products, and that's really important because it really is expansive beyond just the technology, right? It's about the concepts and the principles of the design of the UI. How that's done in a way that is optimal for the user, and that all of this is implemented using multiple technologies and platforms. So, building on that, this is a slide you've probably seen before. This comes from SAP's Fiori Roadmap. And I like it because it really does depict well the major principles that went into the consideration for Fiori, right? What were the primary focuses around people, business, and technology? And so just to pick on a couple of them, on the people side, it's really a user-centric design, and it was really intended to be designed to facilitate interaction with the application in a way that's much more intuitive for users. It's intended to be a design that is much more like the typical modern applications that you see, things that are more like what we're used to as consumers using apps on say mobile devices. From a business standpoint, the one area that I'll focus on is around simplifying that user experience. So, SAP has been very focused on simplifying processes, in particular using S/4HANA to do that. So really as part of that, this is an idea around simplifying that process along with that user interface. And then finally, the technology piece of it. So the web-based technology to enable that. So if you look at Fiori, it really is in that sweet spot of where all three of those come together and focusing on those design principles. So when people think of Fiori, they talk about it frequently as the web interface, and that's really just one component, right? It's all three. But we are today going to focus on primarily the technology. We're going to look at some of the key points you have to keep in mind as you think about what that means from a testing perspective. So Fiori is not one technology, but multiple. When I talk about Fiori being, the interface for S4HANA, so this is an example here. If you look at the UI technology guide for S4HANA 1610, you'll find in there the specific item that's on the screen here that it does mention that Fiori apps are using SAP UI5. So that is what everyone typically thinks of as being the Fiori technology. But as you read further, it is very clear. It says it does use differing technologies from UI5, and that includes Web Pro apps. You'll also find SAP GUI for HTML or Web GUI. You'll find those kinds of apps. You'll also, in some cases, see NetWeaver Business Client even appearing as one of the technologies. So the key takeaway here is that Fiori isn't one technology, but multiple. But in keeping with that overall Fiori design concept, they're all applying that same design theme. So if you look at what we're used to seeing as sort of the Fiori look and feel, what you see, say, in the Fiori LaunchPad, how that whole design theme applies, SAP is specified. Here's how the traditional SAP GUI looks, and when rendered in Fiori, you'll see something that looks very similar. Same thing for Web Pro. Right, so it's nice because these are very familiar screens, right? From a user standpoint, it facilitates a level of comfort with the application. It looks very much like you're used to seeing it looking, but it does have that consistent Fiori theme, design theme applied to it. So you've also got that consistency across the UI, regardless of what the technology is. So from a testing standpoint, though, what that means, though, is that you do have to be aware of what that underlying technology is, right? So it's Fiori, but you have to understand the details. One other thing, when you're thinking about testing for Fiori, as we all know, Fiori is evolving, right? For those of us who worked with the SAP GUI for years, we got pretty used to the fact that all in all, it didn't change all that much. Certainly, there were changes, but it wasn't you didn't see really significant dramatic changes in the UI. It might not have been the prettiest, but it was highly functional. It's very predictable in terms of what you're going to get. Fiori is different. So, when you look, you'll see, as you can see on the screen here, Fiori has its own roadmap. And if you look at this, what it calls out here, this is the roadmap from May of this year. Right, it calls out that in the current release at that point, which is version 1.46 of UI5, you'll see there are new controls that are being, or were built in at that point into the Fiori product, and the controls are available on the pages. So there is this evolution that's going on. And if you look, it's not just one roadmap, but if you look within that roadmap document, it's actually multiple, right? These are just a sample of some of the roadmaps that you'll see as you go through it. So what this means is that this change is pretty significant. There's a lot of change. That change is going to be occurring constantly. As a matter of fact, I went out just to confirm on the links here and found that the document that's out there is no longer the May 12th, 2017 roadmap, but it's actually the August 8th roadmap, right? So we know that the SAP is constantly updating those roadmaps. So it's something that you have to keep up with. And from a testing standpoint, that's going to be significant. And this is a lot, right? If you look at the Fiori roadmap from May, it's 377 pages long. So that gives you some idea of what you're, what you're looking at from a testing standpoint. So one of the things that you have to know is when somebody says, what UI are you using? Oh, I'm using Fiori. You actually have to qualify that and say, okay, well, which Fiori, right? Which one? What version are you using? So I put this up just to illustrate some of the changes that you see. So if you look on the left there, that's actually a screenshot from SAP's Fiori Cloud demo. And that was actually UI5 version 1.28.43. Right, so that was all UI5. That's the look and feel of the Fiori LaunchPad on that demo site. If you look at HANA 1511, S4 HANA 1511, the LaunchPad looks relatively similar, not a whole lot of change, and it's using UI5 version 1.30 or higher, and that's what was essentially Fiori 1.0. And what you see there is, it's that pretty much consistent look from the earlier versions of the UI5. And in both cases, right on that LaunchPad, you're looking at a UI5 technology. But what you start to find as you get beyond that LaunchPad is that you start seeing apps that are built using SAP GUI for HTML or WebDynPro running inside a Fiori frame. So now you start seeing where you're getting into those additional technologies. Then if you go to S4 HANA 1610, that's Fiori 2.0. And compare that to HANA 1511, you can see there's a bit of a difference in the interface, right? So 1511 is the SAP Blue Crystal theme, and HANA 1610 Fiori 2.0 is the SAP Belize theme. So again, color scheme change, but it's indicative of the fact that there are changes that are occurring, and some subtle, some not so subtle, some can be significant. In some cases, if you notice from 1511 to 1610, there were actually objects that changed positions on the page. So what that means is that you've got that constant change that's going on. So you really have to understand what you're looking at. So that's just some background on what we've seen with Fiori. The good news out of that is SAP's come up with a really beautiful interface. It's very, very good look and feel, much more intuitive. It's very tailored to users, particularly around users' roles, right? Designed how they're going to use the products and the applications in the work that they do to perform their functions. They've simplified processes and screens, removed some detail that's not necessarily required for, say, a casual user as opposed to a power user. So what they've done is they've placed the user first and in the center of that entire user experience design. So that's the good news. The bad news is that from a QA standpoint and from testing, it's a difficult interface to test. What we've found is that there are a lot of controls that are not standard HTML controls. So you might see something that looks like a typical control you might expect, what you find is that it's not actually implemented as a standard control. So you have to understand how to recognize those objects. If you're not able to identify those objects, it makes them much more difficult to interact with them as they're intended to work. One thing that we have found is that there's a lot of lazy loading of lists. So if you've got long lists of data and you were searching for an item on a page, it's not necessarily on that page. So you have to understand how to handle lazy loaded lists and be able to work with that, which can be pretty complex. Another thing we found is that some of these pages are massive. We've seen some instances where there are up to 20,000 HTML div tags on a single page. So just think about what that implies from a complexity standpoint if you're having to work your way through a page to understand what the objects are. And finally, the last point is the good news is it's customizable by the user, so they can move things around on the page. From a testing standpoint, that can really pose issues if you're going with a positional-based approach to recognizing objects.
So, and I'd like to make another point here as well. We found that, especially with Fiori 2 applications like 1610 HANA, that the application itself is very intense on CPU. We've seen times where just going into the home page for where all the tiles are, and the CPU is running at 50% just for the browser itself. And that, so therefore, keep in mind of the target machines that you're set up to do the QA testing on there.
So that's actually a good segue. So what I'd like to do now is hand it over to Aaron, and he's going to talk a little bit about if you're testing a Fiori application, what would it look like if you were to do that using a traditional testing tool?
Okay, thanks, Mike. So first off, I'm as our solution manager, Fiori application right here, and what I'm going to try and do is build automation with Selenium, and for logging in, selecting a tile, and navigating around into a subsection within Fiori. So I'm going to log in. And I want to scroll down. I want to select this Test Suite Preparation tile here. This opens up a new tab within my browser. And I'm going to select the Maintenance row within this table and select Test Cases. And then we may want to select one of these rows inside of here and possibly do some validation against this data over here on the right. Okay, pretty simple. Now then, I'm going to come back, going to log out. And go back to the home page. The first thing I need to do is figure out how am I going to build automation against this. I could have used the Selenium IDE, but as of Firefox version 55, they've discontinued support for the Selenium IDE. So I'm forced to actually go through and actually write code to do this. I'm going to use C# within Visual Studio here, and I have a unit test project already set up. I pulled down the NuGet package for WebDriver, for Selenium WebDriver, and I've already started writing some code here for this. First off, I instantiate a new instance of the Firefox driver, and I have the URI to our Firefox instance here, and we navigate to the URI. So all that really does is open up the browser to that URL, which will present me to the login page. The next thing I need to do is figure out, okay, what element on the web page do I need to look for in order to enter the username and password? To do that, I need to come back over into Firefox, and I'm actually going to right-click on the page and inspect element. And with the developer tools that we have within Firefox, we can go right into the actual HTML element. I see that it is an input field, and it has a ID of username field enter. This is fantastic. This is a strong ID. This is very easy for me to identify, and it'll be consistent across every single trip to this page. Therefore, back in Firefox now, I do driver FF, find element, I do by ID, and I pass in the actual value for that ID as username field enter, and then I'll do a send keys of mveach. And then I need to go back and do the same thing for password, and we see it's an input as the ID of password field enter, and we can come back and do the same thing. Finally, we'll inspect that login element, and it has a button ID of login link. Thank you, SAP, for building a web page that has strong IDs that are consistent, and it makes it very easy to use Selenium to automate this portion of it. Okay, fantastic. So let's just trust that this works. Now I'm going to log in. Oops. Okay. Now I actually want to find this clickable area through here and build automation against it to test for this test suite. So I right click and I say inspect element. And what happens here is that I found a div element. and its ID is __tile27. Well, in this scenario, I could do the same, implement the same strategy. However, my test case will be brittle. The reason being is that we cannot guarantee that, for every user that we use to run the script, that the 27th tile will be that test suite. Based upon Fiori personalizations, you could have, you could render completely different. So therefore, using ID as a strategy is difficult for us at that time. So we need to find a different alternative for identification. Well, as I go look in this element, I can see the class is 1x1, SAP MGT, SAP Employer. That doesn't tell me enough really in terms of a specific instance of this as test suite. There's another element of data-SAP UI, tile 27, that's the same as the ID. But the title looks interesting for me here. Test suite, test preparation, neutral. Okay, I feel pretty confident that that's going to be unique across all the tiles. Great. So what I want to do is come back into Visual Studio and I'm going to try and write basically what's called a CSS selector. And I'm going to look for a div and specifically with a title of test suite, test preparation neutral. And actually I'll leave a space here because that's what I read at that point. Okay, looking for this title this way. And so to leverage that, I'm going to use my driver, find element, and I'm going to use by CSS selector, and I'm going to pass this value in. Okay, and then once I do find it, I'm going to click it. We run my test. It logged in just fine. Nothing happened. And I come back and I look, and I've got an exception being thrown. Enable locate element div title test suite preparation. Okay, what's going on here? Let me go back and take a look to see, am I seeing this correctly? I'm going to right-click on here and do edit as HTML. Oh wow, look at my title, test suite, test preparation neutral. Well, it's got a lot of white space in there and carriage return line feeds. Oh, this is getting harder. So on and so forth. And I went through and I tried a lot of different combinations last night when I was working through here, and I had a difficult time using the CSS selector to go through it and find this. I could possibly go through and do some other combination of some other div and so on and so forth. But you get a sense of what's really involved in actually building automation using an open source tool like Selenium. The responsibility of you to solve these HTML issues, you have a much greater problem of degree of difficulty for solving that. Okay, so we're going to hand it over to Mike, and he's going to show how to use certified to accomplish the same thing.
Okay. So as Aaron was just talking, right, there are a number of points that we overcome, and we can talk about some of these as we're going through. But we've got issues with Fiori LaunchPads. You have to be able to handle it, the specialized text boxes. There's a lot of complexity that goes in that Fiori testing. So that was just an example, right? It's pretty simple, straightforward. So what we want to do is just take a moment here and we'll look at how would we do that same type of test using Worksaw Certify. So if I bring up, I've got that same test solution manager window. I'll bring up Worksaw Certify. So what I've done here is I've got a test that we've already built a number of the steps in it, right? As Aaron was showing, we had steps that would take us through screens, through the test suite preparation, into the solution documentation. What we want to do is just show just that one simple step that he was attempting with Selenium, how would we actually accomplish that with Worksaw? So I've got these steps. We built this using our optimizations, and what I'm going to do here is just use our live touch capability, and I'm going to come into the same page. I'm just going to scroll down here, and with live touch, I'll come in. And what you'll see is live touch is going to put a red box around that object. Now it suddenly recognizes that is an object that I can select. So what it's doing now is it's identifying what that object is, and then we can see that it's selected the object, and that's it. So I'm done. So when I come back into my certified test, just for that one step, right, on selecting that Fiori test suite test preparation tile, we've now got the step here that will execute that. So now if I save my test, I can actually run this. And so what you're going to see is, now this is certify in action, right? So what it's going to do is it's going through and executing those steps. So that first screen that we saw was UI5, right? When we come into this page, this is an example of what I mentioned before, where you have actually it's a NetWeaver Business Client running inside of a Fiori frame. So we've got that inside the UI5. So it went through, it identified, selected the object from the drop-down list, selected a row, right? Proceeded then into the next screen, and this one is just NWBC. So we're looking at NetWeaver Business Client here, and it's going to go through and identify a particular row on the table, and it's going to go through and do some validations on that, right? And so when that's done, we'll be able to see that the certify has run the test to completion. And so I can see for each one of these steps where we've gone through, we've clicked on the tile, we proceeded to the next window where we've done the select of the item in the drop-down, selected the item in the row, right? Done a verification, looked for a particular value on the screen, and then we're even able to capture the image of the screen to indicate, you know, we've got validation or proof, right, of that successful test execution. So that's how we address that testing of those Fiori applications using Worksoft Certify. So if I come back, we talk about some of the things that are in place that actually make that possible, right? Oh, I'm sorry, I think I skipped a step. I think we wanted to show one other point. Let me come back, right? I think this is Aaron, we wanted to look at.
So Mike, you know, one of the things that I'm curious about is that what would it take to identify the table that we saw? You know, because tables can be pretty tricky, because typically on these applications in Fiori, we don't necessarily have a table HTML element to go bind to. It's a series of divs and JavaScript and CSS and so on and so forth.
Right, and I was moving a little too quickly. I meant to bring that up and show that here. So let me come back to this page, right? Because this is the first page where we encountered this table here. So if we're doing this with Certify, just use it as an example. If I come in with the live touch, right? If I position the mouse over the table, so you want to talk about what's actually going on there?
Yeah, so essentially we've built these pre-built optimizations that encapsulate that logic of identifying this table based upon the rules of the div and possibly, you know, the title and possibly CSS and other combinations of attributes. So we've done all that work for you, and we give that to you as part of your use of Certify. So here, Live Touch is saying, hey, I recognize, based upon the rules that we specified in the optimization, that this grouping of HTML elements is a table. And so when Mike clicks this and creates a row or a test step within the certified process, and what it's going to do is that it's going to give us all of the power that we expect of certified and all the actions available to it to operate against that piece of HTML as a table. And so just like, you know, we have find rows, the default action against here, but we can do other things based on tables. And really these optimizations are, accelerators for you to build your automation against Fiori applications.
Okay.
Yeah, so the advantage of these optimizations are you can now build automation much faster than what you could in an open source tool like Selenium. And another thing too is that you don't, as you build these optimizations, they are much more resistant to change across the Fiori releases and from one product to the next. Yeah, and again, we talked about earlier about lazy loading within these tables. The Certify deals with lazy loading very well with these optimizations.
So, and all of this is really using just what is the object action framework, right? So we have a patented object action framework that's been in place, part of Certify for many years now. And what we're doing is we're really leveraging that combination of the object action framework along with those optimizations to really be able to address these really massive and complex web pages that the users can customize, they can move things around, but because we understand the object, we understand how to identify them, we understand how to interact with them, as changes occur, right, we're much less impacted by changes in Fiori and in the application. So, Certify really is pretty uniquely qualified to work with these Fiori applications. So, to kind of bring it all together here, if we're looking at what are some of the benefits, right, the benefits of Fiori, and what are some of the challenges that come along with it. The benefit from an end user standpoint is it's a much better user experience, right? It's a very positive change for end users. The challenge though, right, as we said, it's challenging for the QA teams, much more difficult to test these applications. Another benefit, of course, is that they get that consistent user experience. So regardless, whether it's UI5, whether it's Web GUI, whether it's WebDyn Pro, you get that consistent look and feel. But again, that change in the technology really makes that automation much more difficult. And you really have to understand what you're working with. We really take that and we remove a lot of that by understanding what those objects are and how we interact with them. So, as SAP is changing Fiori, that's going to occur very rapidly. As those changes are introduced, you have to be able to respond to those in a very robust manner, right? So that the tests have to be very resilient and not brittle, and have to be able to adapt to changes easily. And that means really that the traditional testing tools and approaches are not sufficient, and they're really not going to be able to keep pace. If you think about not just the pace of change in Fiori, but there's the HANA application changes. All of that means you're going to be testing on a very frequent basis, and these traditional approaches really aren't going to be sufficient. And the real solution is being able to use Worksoft Certify, using that object action framework, and with the optimizations that we have, we're really able to handle the complexities of automating those Fiori tests and all the changes that will occur as the product evolves. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Aaron. Now we're going to move into the portion of the webinar where we take your questions. As a reminder, if you do have a question, you can use the question feature at any time in the GoToWebinar pane to ask that question. And we already have some great ones coming in. The first one, Aaron, how can I get access to the test optimizations that you mentioned?
Sure. So on our customer portal download section, we have a number of them posted out there already, and with more being posted very soon.
Fantastic. Our next question, can we add regular expressions to objects?
Yeah, so we essentially have, within our attribute builder, when you edit an object, we have options for starts with, ends with, and contains, and that sort of thing. So that's how we handle that particular problem.
Okay, is Worksoft Capture available or possible with Fiori?
Yes, it is.
What happens when there's a new version of Fiori?
So we work with our SAP, they're a partner of ours, and so we get access to their applications. So we can go and invest our time to build these optimizations for you and make them available as soon as we can.
Okay, in the Selenium demo, what if you were to select an object like the tile by name and then it changes later on? How would that be handled?
Well, that all depends on the Selenium demo in terms of the programmer, how to handle that particular issue. You would have to deal with that in a programmatic way of being able to, have different, scenarios for dealing with those, changes in names. Whereas within Certify, we have the concept of variables and so on and so forth. And so we have many different strategies for solving that problem.
Can we have Firefox browser automation in Worksoft Certify?
Yes. And so what happened was that, right now we have IE, Firefox, and Chrome support.
Okay. For custom Fiori apps, will the approach for recording the scripts remain the same as for a standard app?
They certainly should remain the same.
All right, and we have some great questions coming in. As a reminder, you can continue to submit those at any time. Is Worksoft for Fiori a separate entity or an add-on to the existing Worksoft version?
So Fiori is really something that we addressed using the optimizations that we talked about. So it's standard functionality that comes with Certify. There's really nothing different. If you think about it, right, web pages are all different. Different vendors, different developers build them differently. Certify can see the web page, but by using the optimizations, the analogy is kind of like it's eyeglasses, right? We're able to see it much more clearly and understand exactly how to interact with it. But again, it's all out of the box functionality. The optimization can just help us with that particular application.
Can Worksoft automation only be used for SAP Fiori or a web application?
No, we have optimizations to work with multiple applications. I mean, not just SAP, right? We work with Salesforce. We work with
Oracle Fusion, yeah,
any number
Iris, and so on and so forth.
Right. And also, we've got mainframe as well, right? So it's not just around new. We are also able to automate, the older legacy technology. So mainframe interfaces, mobile interfaces, right? Oracle, Java.
Yes. Windows.
It's a very long list.
Yeah.
Yep.
If it's got a UI, we want to automate it.
We have another question about the optimizations. Will those be available for download? Where would I get
those? Are on the customer portal, and you can download them there. Portal.worksoft.com.
Awesome. We had a question, as we frequently do, to share a copy of the recording. And again, as a reminder, we will be sharing a copy of the recording with everybody that is registered for you to review later, or perhaps to share with any colleagues you think might benefit from it.
Yeah, so I see a question of will XF Learn work with tables in Fiori? Yes, the answer is that it will.
Do we have pre-built-in transactions for modules like SAP Tile?
Yeah, we have master content to help you as an accelerator for pre-built automation for SAP. That sort of thing. I'm not really sure about the specific nature of that question.
Sure. Right. And just as a point, right, Tau is end of life, right? SAP is not doing anything further with Tau, so just a point to keep in mind. Right. So yeah, we do have customers who are replacing Tau, not just Tau, right? There are other testing applications that customers are looking to replace using Certify, but certainly that is one.
All right, we have time for a couple more questions. Is Worksoft able to automate SAP Ariba effectively?
The answer is yes. We've done that with a number of customers already.
Let's see. How stable is Worksoft Certify with object properties when compared to other automation tools?
They're very stable. Yeah. We do this. This is what our job does, and we do it better than anyone else. You know, we have multiple algorithms that actually solve this problem.
Does Worksoft need special access to the S/4HANA system, or has it been possible only because SAP is now on Web UI?
No, I mean, as long as we can get to access to a browser that is open up the web application, you know, we can then build automation against it. We don't have to have specialized hooks into the S/4HANA system.
All right, and time for one final question. Will automation work for older Fiori versions and those systems which are not equipped with S/4HANA?
Yes, it will.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Aaron. Thank you to everyone for attending. If we weren't able to get to your question, we will be in touch with more information. As mentioned earlier, we will be sending you a link to the recording of the webinar. And if you're interested in learning more about Worksoft, please visit the customer portal or our website. Thank you for your time today. This concludes the webinar. Have a great day.